Chapter 36. Anne Moi and David Jessel. The following are quotes from their 1989 book, Brain Sex. The sexes are different because their brains are different. The brain, the chief administrative and emotional organ of life, is differently constructed in men and in women. It processes information in a different way, which results in different perceptions, priorities, and behavior. There has seldom been a greater divide between what intelligent, enlightened opinion presumes, that men and women have the same brain, and what science knows, that they do not. In a nutshell, by the time we emerge from the womb, most of the differences between males and females are already formed. Books in a similar vein: Louann Brisendine's The Female Brain, John M. Gottman's The 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work, Alfred Kinsey's Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, and Steven Pinker's The Blank Slate. For thousands of years, everyone treated men and women as quite different. People were assigned roles based on skills, aptitudes, perceptions, and behavior, and it was taken as given that these things depended on what gender you were. In the sexual revolution of the 1960s, however, these role definitions were dismissed as a male conspiracy to maintain social and economic domination over women. Educational policies were reframed to remove gender biases in how children were taught, and the Israeli kibbutz, which threw out the traditional demarcations of male and female jobs, was thought to be a great model. In this new world, never again would a woman simply fall into a role assigned to her by society. Just one thing got in the way of this brave new world of equality: science. While we were being taught to believe that there were no differences between men and women that mattered, advances in brain science and empirical behavior studies were coming up with contrary findings. The sexes were not just different in a physical way, but worlds apart in life priorities, ways of communication, and sexual needs. According to Anne Moi and David Jessel, the idea of equality was a biological and scientific lie. Brain Sex: The Real Difference Between Men and Women was a bestseller and one of the first popular books on gender differences, long before John Gray wrote Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. Superbly written and often amusing, it remains a great example of myth-busting. Moi is a geneticist, and the book is based on plenty of scientific references. There was a lot of information in fewer than 200 pages. Yet despite being over 15 years old, it does not seem dated. Readers seeking the latest information on the link between gender, neurology, and behavior should read Brisendine's The Female Brain. However, Brain Sex is still an excellent all-round treatment of the subject. Sexed in the womb. Children are not born a blank slate, comment Moi and Jessel, ready to be conditioned. At 6 or 7 weeks in the womb, a baby literally makes up its mind with the help of hormones, and is configured into a male or a female patterned brain. Sex differences in the brain originate with the chromosomes, generally XX for female, XY for male. But the fetus will only become a boy if male hormones are present. If they are absent, it will become a female. It is the concentration, timing, and appropriateness of hormonal action on a fetus that organize the neural network into its definite male or female pattern, and these patterns are very resistant to change after birth. Moi and Jessel noted that mammal brains generally are dimorphic, that is, they are either male-patterned or female-patterned. As mammals, therefore, it would have been a freak of nature if the human brain had defied this neural sex patterning. Boys will be boys. Even at a few hours old, before external conditioning can influence them, babies exhibit definite tendencies. A girl baby gazes at people's faces, while boys seem more interested in objects. Girl babies respond better to soothing sounds and are more frightened by noise, reflecting a keener sense of hearing. When babies turn into toddlers, the way they see and experience the world is through the lens of their gender-brain chemistry. Boys are more adventurous in their play and roam more widely. They work to improve their spatial skills, while girls work harder at their interpersonal skills. Girls talk on average a year earlier than boys. Einstein, Moore and Jessel note, was 5 before he could speak. The difference continues at the preschool stage. Boys prefer vigorous play over a large area, with girls tending to more sedentary play and orderly activity. Girls treat newcomers with friendliness and curiosity. Boys show nothing but indifference. Hormones and the brain. At puberty, the brain, which has already been pre-wired by the hormones in the fetal stage, responds to the gush of hormones with massive physical and psychological changes. Teenage boys have a testosterone level 20 times that of girls. And as an anabolic steroid, testosterone bulks up body mass and makes boys think about sex all the time. Whereas the male hormone system remains in steady balance, working like a thermostat, in women the system generates cycles of highs and lows corresponding to the menstrual cycle. In the premenstrual period, the flow of progesterone, which helps to create a feeling of well-being, stops. The effect can be like coming off a drug. The authors note the rise in crime committed by premenstrual women. In the French Penal Code, premenstrual tension is included in the category of temporary insanity, and elsewhere has been used successfully in judicial defenses. Overall, Moore and Jessel conclude male hormones increase aggression, competition, self-assertion, self-confidence, and self-reliance. These traits are reduced in the presence of female hormones. However, as they age, men's level of testosterone declines, and they tend to mellow out. In contrast, changes to their hormonal chemistry see women become more assertive. Intelligence and emotion. Men's brains are more specialized and compartmentalized, with their spatial and language skills located in specific centers, while women's brain functions are generally more diffused, with these skills controlled by centers in both sides. The more focused organization of the male brain may account for male single-mindedness, and men's famous ability to read maps can be attributed to stronger spatial capacity. Women, on the other hand, have greater overall awareness of a situation and are much more successful at picking up small facial cues that men don't see. This helps them to be better judges of character and may account for women's intuition. Women also have more effective peripheral vision and generally better senses all around. Men's brains give them an action orientation and a preference for things over people. They are disturbed when women cry and wonder why it happens so often. Moore and Jessel explain, women see, hear, and feel more, and what they see, hear, and feel means more to them. Women cry more often than men because they have more to cry about. They are receiving more emotional input, reacting more strongly to it, and expressing it with greater force. When a man cries, on the other hand, there must be something seriously wrong. Sex. When it comes to sex, men and women's brains and hormones are so configured that the experience is totally different. Men are easily aroused by visual sexual stimuli. They are happy for the light to be left on, so they can see the action, and enjoy seeing images of breasts and genitalia. Women are aroused when they feel secure and intimate, and their keener sense of touch and hearing gives them a preference for making love in the dark. Men can easily treat sex as an isolated event, and women as objects. A man is probably more truthful when he says, after a fling, "It didn't mean anything." But the event will be a disaster for the woman because for her, sex is inseparable from intimacy and love. Moore and Jessel quote a psychologist's summing up of the differences. Women want a lot of sex with the man they love, while men want a lot of sex. Love and marriage. Men and women enter into a marriage under the misconception that they are essentially the same. They seem compatible. They are not. Women crave emotional intimacy, interdependence, and verbal affirmation in their daily life with their partner, while men assume financial security and a good sex life form the basis of a successful marriage. The man does not properly appreciate just how much a woman's biology makes her vulnerable to changes in mood, while the woman will not know that her man's tendency to blow up at her is in large part attributed to a biologically lower threshold for anger and frustration. Women perennially complain that men do not communicate. Yet men's brains are not structured to make them want to talk frequently about their deepest feelings. The parts of their brain relating to feelings and to conveying thoughts are literally in separate places. Brain sex refers to a number of surveys on men's and women's priorities. These indicate that what men value most in life are power, profit, and independence, while women value personal relationships and security. Men are happier in marriage when their wives look good and provide services, while women seem happier if their husband was affectionate on the day they answered the questionnaire. Given men's inclination to roam, the success of marriage as an institution, Moi and Jessel suggest, is a triumph of the female brain. Power, in any state, depends on the possession of information. In the married state, women have more of it. Marriage works not because women become subservient, but because women's social intelligence enables the relationship to be well managed. Men and women at work. The priority that women give to personal relationships tends to rule out the egocentricity, obsession with success, ruthlessness, and suspension of personal values that can characterize a man's approach to his career. A woman's brain is programmed to find fulfillment in whatever role she does above and beyond some external perception of status, achievement, or success. Men, on the other hand, move into occupations where success can be easily measured. They have historically avoided fields where there is a high concentration of women. On the other hand, there are many success stories of women who have managed to carry their institutions to the pinnacle of success without necessarily copying male styles of management. Psychologists note that women and men have a preferred cognitive strategy, a way of dealing with the world based on the way their brain is wired. A culture with advanced working practices, Moi and Jessel observe, will try to allow both to exist for the greater productive good. Final comments. We think we are free-willed beings who are not determined by our sex, but our brains are so constructed that it is difficult to be objective about which feelings, thoughts, and actions are ours as an individual, and which are simply driven by our gender's natural instincts and hormones. Though not determined by our brain sex, we are strongly shaped by it, and awareness of these shaping forces cannot be a bad thing. Brain sex quotes American sociologist Alice Rossi. Diversity is a biological fact, while equality is a political, ethical, and social precept. Equality is a fine idea, and of course girls and boys should have all the same chances in life. But if they don't go into the same careers, Moi and Jessel note, it does not mean there is something wrong. While being sympathetic to feminist aims, they comment that women become more powerful not when they try to be like men, but on the contrary, when they maximize and celebrate their differences. This may sound like reverse feminism, yet it is the only approach that reflects the biological truth. Instead of trying to deny the differences for some politically correct reason, perhaps we should be marveling at the skills, creations, and particular attitudes to life that each gender contributes. Civilization could not have been created by either males or females exclusively. It needed many different forms of intelligence that only the two sexes in combination can supply. Anne Moi and David Jessel. Anne Moi has a Ph.D. in genetics and runs a UK television production company. With her husband Bill, she wrote, "Why Men Don't Iron: The Fascinating and Unalterable Differences Between Men and Women," 2000. David Jessel is a UK journalist well known for presenting television programs relating to the criminal justice system. He and Moi are also co-authors of A Mind to Crime: The Controversial Link Between the Mind and Criminal Behavior, 1997. Chapter 37. Ivan Pavlov. The following are quotes from his 1927 book, Conditioned Reflexes. Conditioned reflexes are phenomena of common and widespread occurrence. Their establishment is an integral function in everyday life. We recognize them in ourselves and in other people under such names as education, habits, and training. And all of these are really nothing more than the results of an establishment of new nervous connections during the postnatal existence of the organism. If the animal were not in exact correspondence with its environment, it would, sooner or later, cease to exist. To give a biological example, if instead of being attracted to food, the animal were repelled by it, or if instead of running from fire the animal threw itself into the fire, then it would quickly perish. The animal must respond to changes in the environment in such a manner that its responsive activity is directed towards the preservation of its existence. In a nutshell, in the way that our minds are conditioned, we are less autonomous than we think. Books in a similar vein. William James's The Principles of Psychology, V.S. Ramachandran's Phantoms in the Brain, and B.F. Skinner's Beyond Freedom and Dignity. You have probably heard of Pavlov and his famous dogs. But who was he, and what was his contribution to psychology? Born in 1849 in central Russia, he was expected to follow in his father's footsteps and become a priest in the Eastern Orthodox Church. But, inspired by reading Darwin, he escaped the local seminary and went to study chemistry and physics in St. Petersburg. At university, Pavlov became passionate about physiology and worked in the labs of several eminent professors. In time, he became well known for his work as a specialist in digestion and the nervous system. As a physiologist, Pavlov did not think much of the new science of psychology, yet it was this work that would lead him to insights on conditioning, or the way in which animals, including humans, develop new reflexes in order to respond to their environment. Conditioned reflexes, an investigation of the physiological activity of the cerebral cortex, translated from the Russian, is a collection of lectures first given by Pavlov at the Military Medical Academy in St. Petersburg in 1924. In mind-numbing detail, it summarizes the 25 years of research carried out by his team that ultimately led to a Nobel Prize. Here, we look at what Pavlov actually discovered and its implications for human psychology. Animals as machines. Pavlov began conditioned reflexes by noting the lack of knowledge about the brain that existed at the time. He regretted that the brain had become the domain of psychology when it should have been the preserve of physiologists who could determine the facts about its physics and chemistry. He paid tribute to philosopher René Descartes, who, 3 centuries earlier, had described animals as machines, who reacted predictably according to stimuli in their environment in order to achieve a certain equilibrium with it. These reactions were part of the nervous system and occurred along set nerve pathways. One of these reflex reactions is the creation of saliva, and it was the action of the digestive glands in dogs that Pavlov initially investigated. He wanted to chemically analyze the differences in saliva produced in response to food under different conditions. But in his early experiments, Pavlov noticed something strange. There was a psychological element to the dog's saliva reflex. That is, they would begin to salivate simply when they thought they were about to get food. Descartes' idea of the automatic reaction was clearly not so simple. Pavlov wanted to investigate further. Creating reflexes. He decided to try out a range of stimuli on the dogs to see what exactly would provoke their saliva secretion, if it was not just a simple automatic reflex. In order that his experiments would be in real time, he had to perform a minor operation so that some of the dog's saliva passed through a hole to the outside of the cheek and into a pouch where the amounts produced could be measured. Pavlov gave the dogs various stimuli, such as the beat of a metronome, buzzers, bells, bubbling, and crackling sounds, plus showing a black square, heat, touching the dog in various places, and intermittent flashes of a lamp. Each of these occurred just prior to giving food, so when the dog heard, saw, or felt a certain stimulus another time, he started to salivate, even if the food had not appeared. Merely the sound of a beating metronome produced saliva, even if no food was to be seen. Physiologically, there was no difference between the dog's reaction when he heard the metronome and what happened when he actually saw food. For the dog, the metronome, rather than a bowl of meat, came to mean food. Pavlov realized that there were two types of reflexes or responses of an animal to its environment. 1. The natural or unconditioned reflex. For example, a dog's salivation when it begins to eat, to aid its digestion. And 2. The acquired or conditioned reflex, which arises through unconscious learning. For example, when a dog begins to salivate at the sound of a bell, because the sound equates food. The fact that reflexes could be instilled so that they became part of the animal's natural functioning made Pavlov aware that if an animal was really a machine responding to its environment, then it was a very complex machine. He showed that the cerebral cortex, the most advanced part of the brain, was very malleable, as were the nervous pathways linking to it. So-called instincts could be learned and unlearned, since he was also able to demonstrate that reflexes could also be inhibited or extinguished by associating food with something the dog didn't like. Yet Pavlov also noted limits to the creation of conditioned reflexes. They either wore off over time, or the dog sometimes did not bother to respond, or just fell asleep. He concluded that the cerebral cortex cannot be overworked or changed too much. It seemed that a dog's survival and proper functioning required it to retain a certain amount of stability in its brain wiring. Advanced environment responding machines. Pavlov observed two levels in the way in which the animal responded to its environment. There was first a neuroanalysis, in which it used its senses to work out what things were, then a neurosynthesis, to establish how something fit into its existing reactions and knowledge. In order to survive, for instance, a dog must be able to quickly determine if something is a threat to it or not. Some of Pavlov's experiments involved removing a dog's whole cerebral cortex. This turned the dog into little more than a reflex machine. It retained its unconditioned reflexes that were hardwired into its brain and nervous system, but was not able to respond to its environment properly. It could still walk, but if it came to even a small obstacle, like the leg of a table, it did not know what to do. In contrast, with a normal dog, even if there is a minute change in environmental stimulus or something new, an investigatory reflex will cause the animal to prick up its ears or sniff the stimulus. A dog may spend a lot of time simply investigating in order that its reflexes to its environment are fully up to date. Pavlov knew that the results of his experiments did not just apply to dogs. The more advanced the organism, he said, the greater its ability to multiply the complexity of its contacts with the external world, and to achieve a more and more varied and exact adaptation to external conditions. Culture and society could be understood as a complex system of the management of reflexes, with humans only different to dogs to the extent that conditioned reflexes had surpassed the natural ones. While dogs could develop advanced social and territorial knowledge as their optimal response to their environment, human beings had responded by creating civilization. Man and Dog, the Similarities. The final chapter of Conditioned Reflexes concerns the applications of Pavlov's work to humans. Given that a human has a much more complex cerebral cortex than a dog, Pavlov was wary of reading too much into his own work. However, he noted the following parallels. The way human beings are trained, disciplined, and enculturated is not that different to how dogs are taught to do things. We know that the best way to learn something is to do it in stages, in the same way that dogs' conditioned reflexes were affected in steps. And as he found with dogs, humans have to unlearn things as well as learning them. Pavlov had a special soundproofed building created for his experiments because he found that external stimuli affected the ability to condition reflexes. In the same way, most of us cannot study a book if a movie is showing at the same time, and we find it hard to get back into things after a holiday or some break from routine. As with the dogs, neuroses and psychoses occur as the result of extreme stimulation that cannot be properly incorporated into existing thinking and reactions. And finally, the reactions of the dogs could not be predicted. Pavlov recalled that when one of Petrograd's famous floods swept through the experimental quarters, some dogs grew excited, others frightened, some withdrew. In the same way, he noted, we can never predict how a person will react emotionally to, for instance, a strong insult or the loss of a loved one. These reactions seem to mirror the two common psychological reactions to shock, recognized in both dogs and humans: neurasthenia, fatigue, withdrawal, immobilization, and hysteria, neurotic excitation. With the last point, Pavlov's implication was that evolution has ensured that we cannot not react to a major event. We must take account of it in some way. To eventually return to a state of stability, we have to incorporate what we have experienced. The phenomenon of fight or flight in the face of a challenge is the nervous system's manner of self-protection in the short term. In the longer term, the fact that we have had a reaction ensures that we can eventually return to a state of equilibrium with our environment. Final comments. Pavlov saw the cerebral cortex as a complicated switchboard in which groups of cells are responsible for different reflexes. There was always room for more reflexes to be created, but also capacity for existing ones to be altered. His dogs did have automatic characteristics, but at the same time their reflexes and reactions were changeable. The implication for humans? Although we live for the most part through habit or inculturation, we are in a position to change our behavior patterns. We are as susceptible to conditioning as any animal, yet at the same time we also have the ability to break our own patterns if they ultimately prove not to be in our interests. Via feedback from our environment, we learn what are effective responses to life and what are not. Pavlov's research had a major impact on the behavioral school of psychology, which holds that humans are little different to dogs and that we have predictable reactions to stimuli and can be conditioned in certain ways of behavior. For the hardcore behaviorist, the idea of free will is a myth. Whatever inputs are made into a person will yield certain outputs in terms of attitudes or behaviors. Yet Pavlov's own observations seem to contradict this. For instance, he noted that many of the dog's reactions were not predictable. Even when conditioning had occurred, there was still room for canine personalities to be expressed. Given our much larger cerebral cortexes, how much more room for varied expression or responses to environment must we enjoy? Conditioned reflexes has a very plodding scientific style. Reflecting his love of empirical fact, order, and discipline, Pavlov did not allow much of his personality to come through. Yet he was a fascinating figure. Although critical of communism, he flourished after the Bolshevik Revolution, with Lenin handing down a decree that Pavlov's work was of enormous significance to the working classes of the whole world. Given his distrust of the claims of the subject, it is ironic that the name Pavlov has come to be associated with psychology. His focus on measurable physiological reaction alone was almost the opposite approach of the Freudian immersion in inner drives and wishes, yet that focus enabled psychology to come to rest on harder scientific ground. Ivan Pavlov. Ivan Petrovich Pavlov was born in 1849 in Ryazan, in central Russia, the oldest of 11 children, and his father was the village priest. His time at the University of St. Petersburg produced acclaimed work on the pancreatic nerves, and on receiving his degree in 1875, He continued his studies at the Imperial Medical Academy. There he gained a fellowship and later a position as professor of physiology. His doctorate concerned the centrifugal nerves of the heart. In 1890, Pavlov set up the physiological department of the Institute of Experimental Sciences in St. Petersburg, where he did most of his work on digestion and conditioned reflexes. He was in charge of a large team of mostly young scientists. His many honors included membership of the Russian Academy of Sciences, winning the 1904 Nobel Prize for Medicine, and in 1915 being awarded France's Order of the Legion of Honor. His marriage to Serafima, Sarah Vasilievna Karcheskaya, a teacher, in 1881, produced 4 children who lived past infancy, one of whom went on to become a physicist. Pavlov was still working in his laboratories when he died in 1936 at the age of 87. Chapter 38. Fritz Perls. The following are quotes from his 1951 book, Gestalt Therapy. Much of the constant effort you suppose to hold yourself together is actually unnecessary. You do not fall apart, go to pieces, or act crazy if you let up on your deliberate holding back, forcing attention, constant thinking, and active interference with the trends of your behavior. Instead, your experience begins to cohere and to organize into more meaningful wholes. Some of us have no heart or no intuition. Some have no legs to stand on, no genitals, no confidence, no eyes or ears. In a nutshell, be alive every minute in your physical world. Listen to your body. Don't live in abstractions. Books in a similar vein. Milton Erickson's My Voice Will Go With You. Karen Horney's Our Inner Conflicts. R.D. Laing's The Divided Self. Abraham Maslow's The Farther Reaches of Human Nature. And Carl Rogers' On Becoming a Person. The Esalen Institute on the California coast at Big Sur was an epicenter of the 1960s social revolution. Literally on the edge, perched on steep hills high above the Pacific Ocean, it attracted people who wanted to push the boundaries of the self and break free of society's constraints. Fritz Perls, a psychologist, arrived at Esalen in 1964. Having grown up in avant-garde Berlin and fled from Hitler's Germany to the United States, Esalen must have seemed like a spiritual home, and he spent much time there until his death in 1970. Charismatic and sometimes cantankerous, Perls was one of the early West Coast personal development gurus. His philosophy was that the modern man or woman thinks too much, when they should be experiencing, feeling, doing. And his slogan, "Lose your mind and come to your senses," chimed perfectly with the counterculture. Gestalt Therapy, Excitement and Growth in the Human Personality, written with the brilliant radical Paul Goodman and a college professor and patient of Perls, Ralph Hefferlein, became the manifesto of a new type of psychotherapy. Though he had trained in Freudian psychoanalysis, Perls had long since dispensed with the couch, instead finding that confrontational group sessions were often the best way of piercing a person's psychological body armor and letting their true, vibrant self out. For a book about excited feeling, Gestalt therapy can be a tedious read, requiring a fair amount of concentration. Its purpose, however, was to lay out the theoretical basis for Gestalt therapy ideas. Its theme of shaking off the straitjackets of normal societal roles to live in the here and now made it a very confronting work. It is easy to forget how novel it would have seemed in 1950s America. Gestalt equals wholeness. Have you ever seen those pictures where, if you look one way, you see a beautiful woman, but then, from the same drawing, an old hag appears? If so, you have had a Gestalt or aha experience. There is no exact English translation, but the word Gestalt roughly means shape or form or the wholeness of something. The Gestalt school of psychology, associated with figures such as Max Wertheimer, Wolfgang Kohler, Kurt Lewin, Kurt Goldstein, Lancelot Law White, and Alfred Korzybski showed that in experiments to do with visual perception, the brain always tries to complete the picture when incomplete images are put before it. We are programmed to find a figure against a ground or background, that is, to give attention to one thing at the expense of another, and finding meaning amid a chaos of color and shape. Pearls took ideas from Gestalt psychology and fashioned from it his own form of therapy. He wanted to apply the idea of wholeness to personal well-being, and borrowed the notion that a person is always being shaped by a certain dominant need, the figure, and when this need is satisfied, it drops back into the background, the ground, making way for another need. In this way, all organisms regulate themselves, getting what they require for their survival. The issue with human beings, however, is that our complexity can muddy the waters of the simple need-satisfaction equation. We can repress some needs and overemphasize others. Or our idea of survival can get warped, so we believe we must maintain ourselves in a certain way, even if to an outsider what we are doing is stupid. Our dominant need becomes connected totally with our sense of self. But it is a self that is no longer fluid or elastic, a neurotic self. It has stopped being aware. In traditional Freudian analysis, the doctor tries to understand such a person by trying to delve into their mind, by treating them as an object. The Gestalt therapist, in contrast, appreciates the person as part of their environment. The mind, the body, the environment are all part of one consideration. Instead of psychology's tendency to break things down into pieces, Gestalt therapy apprehends the whole. In Pearl's words, the Gestalt outlook is the original, undistorted, natural approach to life, that is, to man's thinking, acting, feeling. The average person, having been raised in an atmosphere full of splits, has lost his wholeness, his integrity. Contact and confluence. Smell, touch, taste, hearing, and seeing are our contact boundary with the world. When someone has begun to think of themselves as an isolated object, they have ceased to be a sensing, contacting, excited being. Pearls recognized how modern life, sitting in air-conditioned offices, anesthetizes us. We purposefully reduce our level of awareness to create a more ordered existence with no surprises. But what do people say on their deathbed? Not, "I wish I had sought more security or earned more money," but, "I wish I had taken chances, done more things." That is, had more contact with life. Someone in genuine contact with their environment, Pearl notes, is in a state of excitement. They are feeling, one way or another, all the time. Neurotics, in contrast, instead of risking real contact with the world, withdraw into the inner world they know, and do not grow. Healthy people engage with life, eating and food-getting, loving and making love, aggressing, conflicting, communicating, perceiving, learning, and so on. The opposite of contact is confluence, acting out of what you have been taught to do, out of habit, or seeing things as you should be seeing them. Pearls gives the example of someone standing in a gallery looking at a work of modern art. He feels he is directly perceiving the work, when in fact, he is actually in contact with the art critic of his favorite journal. People grow into the world with heavy expectations to change their basic nature into something they are not, and this gap between our biological nature and society leads to holes in the personality. Some of us have no heart or no intuition. Some have no legs to stand on, no genitals, no confidence, no eyes or ears, Pearls would rather shockingly tell his groups. In Gestalt therapy, people claimed their missing parts, and in the process got back lost aggression or sensitivity. Awareness of body and emotion. Pearls saw a clear difference between introspection and awareness. Awareness was the spontaneous sensing of what arises in you, of what you are doing, feeling, planning. Introspection, on the other hand, was considering the same activities in an evaluating, correcting, controlling, interfering way. The distinction is important because traditionally psychology involves the assumption that we can analyze ourselves as if we are somehow separate to our brain and body. But such analysis only makes us neurotic. What brings us back to sanity and puts us in happy balance with the world is reconnection with our senses. Gestalt therapy contains many experiments Pearls use to get people to increase awareness, such as telling them to feel your body. By lying still and feeling every part of your body, you find some areas feel dead. In other parts, you may experience pain or imbalance. Just the simple act of giving attention to certain areas of muscle or joints may lead you to conclusions as to why your neck is stiff or there is pain in your stomach. Pearls noted, "The neurotic personality creates its symptoms by unaware manipulation of muscles. Often, the experiments resulted in someone having the realization that they are either a nagger or a person nagged at." In another experiment, Pearls asked people to tell themselves what they were seeing and doing in each moment. That is, I am now sitting in this chair, this afternoon, looking at the table in front of me. This moment there is the sound of a car in the street, and I now feel the sun on my face through the window. He then asked them what difficulties they were experiencing while they were doing this. They invariably answered, "What difficulties?" The discovery was that as long as you are fully in the present, noticing and feeling the environment around you, you are trouble-free. Abstract worries and anxieties re-enter only when you leave your environment. Some people found the experience to cause impatience, boredom, or anxiety, which, according to Pearls, indicated how much their normal consciousness lacked actuality. What is hidden can't be transformed. The goal of Gestalt is to stop living life as if you are on automatic. Many people find that they truly live in actuality only a small amount of the time. When they consciously do it more, this can be a breakthrough. Full awareness and attention resolves an issue, Pearls taught, not rationalizing about it. Most of us find that the parts of ourselves we try to throttle into non-existence always come back. Yet purposeful reduction of awareness, or repression, means that we can never change or resolve the issue. If something terrible happened in the past, Pearls taught that we have to bring it fully into the present, even act it out again, in order to own it. Trying to ignore it only gives it more energy. Earnestness versus responsibility. Pearls believed that healthy adults should not throw out completely the ways of children. Spontaneity, imagination, curiosity, and wonder are things we should keep, as all great artists and scientists do, and we should not be deadened by responsibility and always having to make sense. Children are superior to adults in their earnestness, even when they are involved in play. They may leave an activity on a whim, but when they are doing it, nothing else matters. Gifted people retain this very direct awareness, but the average adult is usually not interested enough in what they are doing. Pearls points out that what we think of as being responsible a lot of the time is simply closing ourselves off to living life intensely. As he put it, habitual deliberateness, factuality, non-commitment, and excessive responsibility, traits of most adults, are neurotic, whereas spontaneity, imagination, earnestness and playfulness, and direct expression of feelings, traits of children, are healthy. Final comments. Pearl's philosophy of doing what you feel instead of doing what you ought to do ensured his place in many hearts and minds. His famous Gestalt prayer summed up the spirit of the 1960s. I do my thing, and you do your thing. I am not in this world to live up to your expectations, and you are not in this world to live up to mine. You are you, and I am I, and if by chance we find each other, it's beautiful. If not, it can't be helped. Sometimes the last line was left off the posters, as it didn't seem to gel with the flower power ethos. But then, Pearl often made fun of the seekers of joy, ecstasy, and highs, and made a point of noting the hard work involved in his therapy. It was frequently unpleasant, and raw and could reduce people to tears. No one wanted to have their privacy invaded and be told about the holes in their personality. Yet Pearls pointed out that we can only move on after we admit we are stuck. Like Milton Erickson, Pearls was a master at reading body language. In group sessions, he was often less interested in what someone said than in the tone of their voice and how they were sitting. People were not allowed to discuss anyone not in the room, reinforcing the here and now intensity of Gestalt therapy. He considered himself a good shit detector in people, a skill vital in life that was a long way from the hazy love and peace mantra of the times. Pearls also liked to talk about aggression. He believed that holding in anger denied that humans are essentially animals. We stifle tiredness or boredom, but we should like to be cats, yawning and stretching to put ourselves back into action again. What the body wants, we should give it, in order to stay in equilibrium. Is there a part of yourself that you have cut off because it was antisocial or not worthy of a nice person? To come alive again, reclaim it. Fritz Perls. Born in 1893 in Berlin, Friedrich Solomon Perls gained his medical degree in 1926. On graduating, he worked at the Institute for Brain-Damaged Soldiers in Frankfurt, where he was influenced by Gestalt psychologists, existential philosophy, and the Neo-Freudians Karen Horney and Wilhelm Reich. In the early 1930s, with Germany becoming unsafe for Jews, Perls and his wife Laura moved to the Netherlands and then South Africa. There, they established their own psychoanalytic practices and the South African Institute for Psychoanalysis. But they became critical of Freudian concepts and slowly developed the Gestalt method of practice, articulated in Ego, Hunger, and Aggression, a revision of Freud's theory and method, 1947. In 1946, the couple moved to New York, setting up an Institute of Gestalt Therapy in 1952. After separating, Fritz moved to California, and Laura stayed in New York with their children. He went to Esalen in 1964. The year before he died, Perls published Gestalt Therapy Verbatim, 1969, which chronicles sessions held at Esalen, and his autobiography, In and Out of the Garbage Pail. Chapter 39. Jean Piaget. The following are quotes from his 1923 book, The Language and Thought of the Child. Child logic is a subject of infinite complexity, bristling with problems at every point. Problems of functional and structural psychology, problems of logic, and even of epistemology. It is no easy matter to hold fast to the thread of consistency throughout this labyrinth, and to achieve a systematic exclusion of all problems not connected with psychology. The child seems to talk far more than the adult. Almost everything he does is in the tune of remarks such as, "I'm drawing a hat," "I'm doing it better than you," etc. Child thought, therefore, seems more social, less capable of sustained and solitary research. This is true only in appearance. The child has less verbal countenance simply because he does not know what it is to keep a thing to himself. Although he talks almost incessantly to his neighbors, he rarely places himself at their point of view. In a nutshell, children are not simply little adults thinking less efficiently, they think differently. Books in a similar vein. Edward de Bono's Lateral Thinking, Alfred Kinsey's Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, and Steven Pinker's The Blank Slate. In the same way that Alfred Kinsey spent years collecting specimens of and writing about the gall wasp before he launched himself on the study of human sexuality, Jean Piaget was a master of natural world observation before he turned his mind to human matters. As a child and teenager, he wandered the hills, streams, and mountains of western Switzerland collecting snails, and later wrote his doctoral thesis on the mollusks of the Valais Mountains. What he learned in these years, to observe first and classify later, set him up well for examining the subject of child thought, which had attracted plenty of theories but not a great deal of solid scientific observation of actual children. Entering the field, Piaget's main wish was that his conclusions be drawn from the facts, however difficult or paradoxical they seemed. Added to his methodical skills was, for a scientist, an unusually good grasp of philosophy. Child psychology was a tangle of epistemological questions, yet he decided to focus on very down-to-earth issues such as, why does a child talk, and who is she talking to? And, why does she ask so many questions? If there were answers, he knew they could benefit teachers greatly, and it was for educators mainly that he wrote The Language and Thought of the Child. Most explorers of the child mind had focused on the quantitative nature of child psychology. Children were thought to be how they are because they have fewer mental abilities than adults and commit more errors. But Piaget believed that it was not a matter of children having less or more of something. They were fundamentally different in the way they think. Communication problems exist between adults and children not because of gaps in information, but due to the quite different ways they have of seeing themselves within their worlds. Why a child talks. In the opening pages, Piaget asked what he admitted was a strange question. What are the needs which a child tends to satisfy when he talks? Any sane person would say that the purpose of language is to communicate with others. But if this were the case, he wondered why children talk when there is no one around, and why even adults talk to themselves, whether internally or muttering aloud. It was clear that language could not be reduced to the one function of simply communicating thought. Piaget conducted his research at the Rousseau Institute in Geneva, opened in 1912 for the study of the child and teacher training. There he observed children of 4 and 6, taking down everything they said while they worked and played, and the book includes transcripts of their conversations. What Piaget quickly discovered, and what every parent can confirm, is that when children speak, a lot of the time they are not talking to anyone in particular. They are thinking aloud. He identified 2 types of speech, egocentric and socialized. Within the egocentric type, there were 3 patterns. 1. Repetition. Speech not directed to people, saying words for the simple pleasure of it. 2. Monologue. Whole commentaries that follow the child's actions or play. And 3. Collective monologue. When children are talking apparently together, yet are not really taking account of what the others are saying. A room of 10 children seated at different tables may be noisy with talk, but in fact, all are really talking to themselves. He noted that until a certain age, 7, he thought, children have no verbal countenance, but must say anything that comes into their head. A kindergarten or nursery, he wrote, is a society in which, strictly speaking, individual and social life are not differentiated. Because children believe themselves to be the center of the universe, there is no need for the idea of privacy or withholding views out of sensitivity to others. Adults, in contrast, because of their comparative lack of egocentricity, have adapted to a fully socialized speech pattern in which many things are left unsaid. Only madmen and children, as it were, say whatever they think, because only they really matter. It is for this reason that children are able to talk all the time in the presence of their friends, but are never able to see things from the friend's point of view. Part of the reason for the egocentricity of children is that a significant part of their language involves gestures, movements, and sounds. As these are not words, they cannot express everything, so children must remain partly a prisoner of their own mind. We can understand this when we appreciate that the greater an adult's mastery of language, the more likely they are to be able to understand, or at least be aware of, the views of others. Language, in fact, takes people beyond themselves, which is why human culture puts such stress on teaching it to children. It enables them to eventually move out of egocentric thinking. Different thinking, different worlds. Piaget borrowed a distinction from psychoanalysis between 2 types of thought. 1. Directed or intelligent thought, which has an aim, adapts that aim to reality, and can communicate it in language. This thinking is based on experience and logic. And 2. Undirected or autistic thought, which involves aims, that are not conscious and not adapted to reality, based on satisfaction of desires rather than establishing truth. The language of this sort of thinking is images, myths, and symbols. For the directed mind, water has certain properties and obeys certain laws. It is conceived of conceptually as well as materially. To the autistic mind, water is only relevant in relation to desires or needs. It is something that can be drunk, or seen, or enjoyed. This distinction helped Piaget appreciate the development of children's thought up to the age of 11. From 3 to 7, children are largely egocentric and have elements of autistic thought. But from 7 to 11, egocentric logic makes way for perceptual intelligence. Piaget set up experiments in which children were asked to relate a story they had been told or to explain something, such as the workings of a tap, that had been shown to them. Before they were 7, the children did not really care if the people they were talking to understood the story or the mechanism. They could describe, but not analyze. But from 7 to 8 onwards, the children did not assume that the other person would know what they meant, and attempted to give a faithful account, to be objective. Until that age, their egocentrism does not allow them to be objective. What they can't explain or don't know, they make up. But after the age of 7 to 8, children know what it means to give a correct rendering of the truth. That is, the difference between invention and reality. Piaget noticed that children think in terms of schemas, which allow them to focus on the whole of a message without having to make sense of every detail. When they hear something they don't understand, children don't try to analyze the sentence structure or words, but attempt to grasp or create an overall meaning. He noted that the trend in mental development is always from the syncretic to the analytic. To see the whole first, before gaining the ability to break things down into parts or categorize. Prior to age 7 or 8, the child's mind is largely syncretic, but it later develops powers of analysis that mark the shift from the juvenile to the adult mind. Child logic. Piaget wondered why children, particularly those under 7, fantasize and dream and use their imagination so much. He observed that because they do not engage in deductive or analytical thought, there is no reason to make a firm demarcation between the real and the not real. As their minds do not work in terms of causality and evidence, everything seems possible. When a child asks, "What would happen if I were an angel?" to an adult, the question is not worth pursuing because we know it can't be real. But for a child, anything is not only possible, but explainable, since no objective logic is required. To satisfy their mind, all that is required is motivation. For example, a ball wanted to roll down the hill, so it did. At age 6, a boy might feel that a river flows down a hill because it wants to. A year later, he will explain it in terms of, water always flows downhill, so that is why the river is flowing down this hill here. Why do many young children incessantly ask, why? Because they want to know the intention of everyone and everything, even if it is inanimate, not realizing that only some things have intentions. Later, when children can appreciate that most things are caused rather than intended, their questions become about causality. The time before they understand cause and effect, pre-causality, coincides with the time of egocentrism. The world of make-believe, as we tag it in our superior way, has the feel of cold, hard reality to younger children, because within it, everything makes sense according to their own intentions and motivations. In fact, as Piaget wryly observed, a child's world seems to work so well that according to their understanding, logic is not required to support it. Adults often find it difficult to understand children because they have forgotten that logic plays no role in a child's mind. We cannot make children think in the same way as us before they reach a certain age. At each age, children gain a particular equilibrium in relation to their environment. That is, the way they think and perceive at age 5 perfectly explains their world. But that same way does not work when they are 8. In later writings, Piaget explored the final stage of mental development, beginning at age 11 or 12. Teenagers' abilities to reason, think abstractly, make judgments, and consider future possibilities make them essentially the same as adults. From this point on, it is a matter of increases in ability, rather than qualitative changes. Final comments. Despite some questions about the precise timings, Piaget's stages of child development have largely stood the test of time, and his impact on preschool and school education has been great. Yet Piaget never considered himself a child psychologist, and was more accurately a scientist focused on theories of knowledge. His observation of children led to broader theories on communication and cognition, because what he learned about the child's mind threw the adults into clearer view. For instance, it was not only children who used schemas to make sense of the world. Adults also have to accommodate and assimilate new information by making it conform to what we know already. Piaget invented the field of genetic epistemology, which means how theories of knowledge evolve or change in relation to new information. He saw the mind as a relatively arbitrary creation, formed in such a way that reality can be explained according to that person's own model of the world. Education has to take account of these models, rather than simply shoving facts down people's throats. Otherwise, information will not be assimilated. Such a method of education results in dull conformists who are uncomfortable with change. And Piaget was ahead of his time in suggesting that we should educate people to be innovative and inventive thinkers who are aware of the subjectivity of their own minds, yet mature enough to accommodate new facts. His initial experiments observing the language and thought of the child, therefore, led to great insights into how adults process knowledge and create new understanding. Jean Piaget. Born in 1896 in Neuchâtel, western Switzerland, Piaget was the son of a professor of medieval literature at the local university. His strong interest in biology resulted in the publication of several scientific articles before he had even left school, and in 1917 he published a philosophical novel, Recherche. After gaining his Ph.D., Piaget began studying child linguistic development, and in 1921 he became the director of the Institut Jean-Jacques Rousseau in Geneva. From 1925 to 1929, he was professor of psychology, sociology, and the philosophy of science at the University of Neuchâtel, after which he returned to the University of Geneva to be its professor of scientific thought for the next decade. He simultaneously held posts with the Swiss education authorities. In 1952, Piaget became professor of genetic psychology at the Sorbonne in Paris, and until his death in 1980, directed the International Center for Genetic Epistemology in Geneva. Key books include The Child's Conception of the World, 1928, The Moral Judgment of the Child, 1932, The Origins of Intelligence in Children, 1953, Biology and Knowledge, 1971, and The Grasp of Consciousness, 1977. Chapter 40. Steven Pinker. The following are quotes from his 2002 book, The Blank Slate. To acknowledge human nature, many think, is to endorse racism, sexism, war, greed, genocide, nihilism, reactionary politics, and neglect of children and the disadvantaged. Any claim that the mind has an innate organization strikes people not as a hypothesis that might be correct, but as a thought it is immoral to think. Everyone has a theory of human nature. Everyone has to anticipate the behavior of others, and that means we all need theories about what makes people tick. A tacit theory of human nature, what behavior is caused by thoughts and feelings, is embedded in the very way we think about people. In a nutshell, genetic science and evolutionary psychology show that human nature is not simply a result of socialization by our environment. Books in a similar vein. Luann Brisendine's The Female Brain, Hans Eysenk's Dimensions of Personality, William James's The Principles of Psychology, Anne Moore and David Jessel's Brain Sex, and V.S. Ramachandran's Phantoms in the Brain. The well-worn debate about nature versus nurture concerns whether we come into the world already wired to have certain traits or talents, or are totally molded by our culture and environment. In the 1960s and 1970s, parents took on board the expert advice of behavioral psychologists, anthropologists, and sociologists that environment was everything. They did their bit by creating a more peaceful, less sexist world by not letting their boys play with toy guns and giving them dolls instead. Anyone who has had children, however, knows that from day one, each child is innately different to their siblings. Leading experimental and cognitive psychologist Steven Pinker wrote The Blank Slate, The Modern Denial of Human Nature, to correct many wild claims about how malleable the human mind is, and to expose the myth that all our behaviors are the result of socialization. Pinker likens our unwillingness to admit the fact of biologically determined human nature to the Victorians not wanting to discuss sex, and adds that it distorts public policies, scientific research, and even how we see each other. Yet he does not simply take the position that genes are everything and culture is nothing. Rather, his intention is to reveal the facts about how much human nature is shaped by patterns already in the brain, compared to the extent to which we are shaped by culture and environment. History of an Idea. Enlightenment philosopher John Stuart Mill pointed out the importance of experience and the malleability of the human mind, picturing it as a sheet of paper ready to be written on, an idea that became known as the blank slate. Pinker defined this concept as implying that the human mind has no inherent structure and can be inscribed at will by society or ourselves. This contains the logical assumption that everyone is equal, and today we rightly accept that, barring severe mental or physical handicap, anyone can reach any station in life. However, this acceptance also brought with it the view that the forces of biology play no role in accounting for how people are. In a famous passage from Behaviorism, 1924, John B. Watson boasted that if he was given a dozen healthy infants, he could shape them into anything he wanted as adults, whether doctor, artist, beggar, or thief. Even though behaviorism is no longer psychological orthodoxy, its idea of a perfectly blank mental slate has stubbornly remained. It has become the secular religion of modern intellectual life, Pinker says. Quite understandably, we don't want to go back to a time in which biological differences between people are highlighted, because this seemingly allows for racial, gender, or class discrimination and prejudice. However, the irony is that the vacuum the blank slate idea creates has allowed it to be used and abused by totalitarian regimes, which believe they can fashion the masses into anything they want. Pinker asks, how many more human re-engineering projects do we need to go through before the blank slate idea is finally laid to rest? We are what we are. Pinker points out that the human mind could never have been blank because it was forged through Darwinian competition over thousands of years. People whose brains made them cunning problem solvers with acute senses naturally triumphed over others, and their genes lived on. Minds that were too malleable were selected out of existence. Evolutionary biologists and some enlightened anthropologists have shown that a range of socially constructed factors, such as emotions, kinship, and differences between the sexes, are in fact, to a large extent, biologically programmed. Donald Brown mapped out what he calls human universals, traits or behaviors found in societies around the globe, regardless of level of development. These include conflict, rape, jealousy, and dominance, but also, as we would expect, conflict resolution, a sense of morality, kindness, and love. Human beings can be brutish and smart and loving because we have inherited the neurological makeup of people who engaged in skirmishes and battles and survived, yet who were also able to live in close community and be peacemakers. Love, will, and conscience, Pinker concludes, are biological too, that is, evolutionary adaptations implemented in the circuitry of the brain. Wired at birth. A variety of research by neuroscientists has found just how minutely set our brains are when we are born. For example, gay men usually have a part of the brain, the third interstitial nucleus in the anterior hypothalamus, that is smaller than normal. This part of the brain is recognized as playing a role in sex differences. Einstein's brain had large and unusually shaped inferior parietal lobules, which are important in spatial and numbering intelligence. In contrast, studies on the brains of convicted murderers found their brains to have a smaller than average prefrontal cortex, which governs decision-making and inhibits our impulses. Identical twins separated at birth have been found to have very similar levels of general intelligence, verbal and mathematical skills, plus personality traits such as introversion or extroversion, agreeableness, and general life satisfaction. They even have the same personality quirks and behaviors such as gambling and television watching. This can be attributed not only to having exactly the same genetic material, but to the fact that the actual physiology of their brains, the valleys and folds and size of certain parts, is almost exactly the same. Many conditions once thought caused by a person's environment alone have now been found to have genetic roots. These include schizophrenia, depression, autism, dyslexia, bipolar illness, and language impairment. Such conditions run in families and cannot be predicted easily from environmental factors. Psychologists are able to divide personality into 5 main dimensions: introverted or extroverted, neurotic or stable, incurious or open to new things, agreeable or antagonistic, and conscientious or undirected. All 5 dimensions can be inherited, with 40 to 50% of our personality related to these genetic tendencies. Pinker acknowledges our fear that if genes affect the mind, then we are completely controlled by genes in our thinking and behavior. However, genes only entail a certain probability. They determine nothing. Final comments. Pinker compares the belief in a blank slate to the cosmology of Galileo's time, when people believed that the physical universe rested on a moral framework. In the same way, today's moral and political sensitivities have meant that scientific fact, the biological basis of human nature, has been swept aside in favor of ideology. We are afraid that these facts will lead to a meltdown of values and a loss of control over the sort of society we want to live in. In response, Pinker recalls a line from Chekhov: "Man will become better when you show him what he is like." Only by sticking to the facts about who and what we are, supplied by biology, genetic science, and evolutionary psychology, can we move forward. There may be many aspects of human nature we don't like to admit, but denying them does not make them go away. The Blank Slate is a big, fat book that will take you a while to read and fully understand. It is an intellectual tour de force, and may well shatter some of your cherished opinions or shift them to firmer scientific ground. It is easy to see why Pinker is in the top echelon of popular science writers today. His work combines scientific gravitas with a highly enjoyable style. Steven Pinker. Born in 1954 in Montreal, Canada, Steven Pinker has degrees from McGill University and Harvard, where he obtained his Ph.D. in experimental psychology. He is best known for his research into language and cognition. Other books include The Language Instinct, 1994, How the Mind Works, 1997, Visual Cognition, 1985, Lexical and Conceptual Semantics, 1992, and Words and Rules, The Ingredients of Language, 1999. Until 2003, Pinker was a professor of psychology at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and director of its Center for Cognitive Neuroscience. He is currently the Johnston Family Professor of Psychology at Harvard University.